Um, uh, Good evening, everyone. My name is Spencer Ruchti. I'm the author events manager here, calling you from Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. I'm calling you from the Gutenberg room, which is starting to look like a lot of storage, a bit of a storage room here as we get into the holiday season. On behalf of Third Place Books and our partners at the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith in Boston, and Community Bookstore in Brooklyn, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's discussion with Damion Searls, who is the author of the new book, The Philosophy of Translation, out now from Yale University Press. I want to thank you all for watching. To all of you out there, feel free to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from. We'd love to hear from you. Third Place Books hosts over 300 author events in person every year, but we could not pass on this opportunity to reopen Zoom for a discussion around this book, Philosophy of Translation. You can sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com for more of these occasional virtual opportunities like this. Or if you live in the Northwest, you should absolutely come visit us in Seattle. This year, we've hosted translators such as Will Vanderheiden, Shelley Fairweather Vega, and Jennifer Croft, and many more. It is a rich city for international literature. And if you're in the Northwest, I hope to see you at one of our readings. So thank you for being here. I also want to thank our partners and friends at Community Bookstore in Brooklyn, and particularly Claire Fallon and Stephanie Valdez, as well as Pierce Alquist, who's the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith. I have learned so much from these booksellers and these community leaders. If you live in Brooklyn or Boston, respectively, please go patronize these bookstores and go spend some time amongst their shelves. I know you will not regret it. The chat window, of course, is open at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use it tonight. Please make comments, clap emojis, respond to what's happening on Zoom here. And during the last 15, 20 minutes or so, we will also have time for your questions, which is one of my favorite parts of every virtual event. So if you have questions for our author this evening, please submit those in the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to also be playing the role of Damion's interlocutor today. Today's conversation will touch on much of the content from this book as we can get to, and will otherwise focus on Damion's day-to-day work as a translator and writer, the arc of his career, as well as the market for translated works. A reminder that this event will be recorded, so if you miss anything today, we'll be emailing a recording to everyone who is registered. And of course, you can order The Philosophy of Translation from your neighborhood independent bookstore. Every purchase you make truly supports the future of our author series, and we thank you for it. And now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce our speaker. Damion Searls is a translator from German, Norwegian, Dutch, and French, and has translated the works of Nobel Prize winners such as Jan Fosse, Thomas Mann, Elfriede Jelinek, Hermann Hesse, as well as many classic modern writers such as Proust, Rilke, Nietzsche, Robert Walser, Christa Wolf, and Victoria Kieland. The list is wonderful and it is extensive. He has also edited a one-volume abridgment of Henry David Thoreau's journal and produced a lost work of Herman Melville's. He is also a critic, an essayist, poet, occasional fictional writer, and has taught at Princeton, Harvard, Wesleyan, and the Iowa Writers Program. Damion has also published a collection of stories with Dalkey Archive Press called What We Were Doing and Where We Were Going, as well as The Ink Blots, which is a history of the Rorschach test and biography of Hermann Rorschach. I do want to keep this brief, but would like to also frame this the conversation that follows by saying I was combing through my bookshelf late last night, and it did strike me just how many of Damion's books that I've acquired over the years, both intentionally and unintentionally. I counted 29 books in all, and I come to this conversation as a bookseller of nearly 8 years. You can say as a fan rather than an academic, a supporter of Damion's work, and as someone with an interest in the market of literature and also how international literature reaches the average reader, specifically American readers. And with that, without further ado, that is the context for today's conversation about this magnificent book, The Philosophy of Translation, from Yale University Press. Please join me in welcoming Damion Searls.
Thank you, silent Zoomers everywhere. Thank you, Spencer.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much again for doing this, Damion. This is a really wonderful opportunity. I did want to start off right by right I mean with the introduction of this book, which recounts a story, your origin story as a translator, meeting Edith Grossman in your late 20s, right as you were trying to figure out if you wanted to be a translator and how one does that, and how one becomes such a thing.
Well,
And
you gave away the punchline, which is that I had no idea how to become a translator. And um, eventually my mom got the bright idea to say, "Oh, why don't you look up Edie? I think she stopped teaching and started doing more translating." And Edie was someone who like I knew since I was 6 from the neighborhood, and I had like babysat her son and read Dr. Seuss books at her house that
Mhm.
we didn't have around the corner and whatever. And I said, "Oh, Edie, she's a translator. What language?" And my mom said, "Oh, I don't know. I think Spanish maybe." And that was when Edie Grossman in one part of my brain, and of course, the legendary Edith Grossman in the other part of my brain collided, and I realized who Edie was. So I didn't meet her in my late 20s. I got back in touch with her, and she was very kind. I had translated my first thing I'd ever translated, which would become my first published translation, which were 3 little nonfiction sort of descriptive vignettes by Peter Handke, of all people.
Mhm.
And she said, "Sure, I'll take a look." She had never read Handke. She didn't know German, but she took a look at my little page and a half translation and was very polite and nice about it. I'm sure better than it deserved. And she said, "Let me just give you a tip, Damion. Uh, Try not to use so many ing words. They're weak in English. Don't use them. So don't say there's a gleaming in the snow. Say there's a gleam. Don't say
Mhm.
so cocoons were hanging from the trees. Say they hung from the trees. It's just better writing." So she went through the page and a half. She circled 3 of my ing words that I had used and said, "These are fine, these are good, but all the rest you should get rid of." And lo and behold, you see where this is going. I went back to the German, and those 3 and only those 3 used the present participle uh, construct in German. All the
Wow.
rest, like it could have been a gleam, but I had said gleaming because I didn't know any.
Yeah.
Um, and so this kind of blew me away. I found over the years when I tell the story that other translators tend not to actually be that impressed. They're like, "Yeah, we know how gerunds work. Like, what's the big deal?" But at the time, like, I was a non-translator and I was impressed. I mean, because it seemed like magic, right? Like,
Yeah.
this author knows what he's doing. She knows what she's doing. I just work here. Like, I'm
Yeah.
just there, and like, she can see right through me to the original in a language she doesn't even know.
Right.
So, I think that there is more to the story than just knowing how gerunds work and being a good writer in English, which Edie obviously was. Um, and that extra piece was reading. She was somehow
Mhm.
reading the original, even though she didn't have the original in front of her and didn't even know German
And
at
didn't
all. But
read
she was
German, right?
doing reading. She wasn't just
Mhm.
writing well in English. She could see something
Yeah.
that I hadn't been able to see, but she could see it anyway. And so it was this kind of iconic realization that, like, oh, it isn't just about improving your German. Like, that doesn't get the job done. That's not all translation is. Something else is going on. So that's why I sort of started the book with that story.
Yeah. And interesting that her this foundational piece of advice was also, I mean, it was a writing tip essentially. Like you could, an American writer could be sitting there with an American teacher and they could, circle the same ing verbs and say, this is not powerful writing. You could tweak this to
Right.
make it more powerful. But yeah, Edie saw something whatever she knew about Honka's writing and knew that it
I mean,
required
nothing.
something
Like
more.
she hadn't even read
Yeah,
him, but like she
yeah.
still could read it
Right.
somehow.
And just knew that there was a force that needed to be something else that needed to be communicated that wasn't literal in the language.
And it absolutely is a writing tip.
Yeah,
I try to think like, how many verbs have I translated since then? I don't know, a
yeah,
million?
yeah,
You know, every single time I have to
yeah,
think, I sit or I'm sitting. Like, English has these two forms. Some of the languages I translate from, like Norwegian, don't.
yeah.
So any usage of the verb in the present could either be I sit or I am sitting or
Hmm.
I'm sitting with a contraction. And you have to decide. And so, like, I've certainly thought about this advice
Yeah.
a million times over the years.
And
But
you
yeah, it did seem to sort of point to something bigger.
and you started translating, or at least this story takes place in your late 20s. Can you talk just briefly about what you were doing before this? Like what brought you to your interest in
Yeah,
translation?
I didn't grow up in a multilingual
Hmm.
household or with family background in German or Norwegian or anything. I just sort of always got the idea that I wanted to learn a second language at some point in my education. And the high school languages didn't really ever take. I took Russian in my first year of college, which I thought was fun, but I didn't keep it up. And then, you know, college was running out. And by that
Hmm.
point, I was a philosophy major and had also like discovered Rilke's poetry, which I really liked. And so I was like, okay, let me do German. I was writing about German philosophy. And so it was senior year in college that I started learning German. Um, but that language clicked for me somehow more than other ones I had done. And so that was the first language I learned um, well enough to translate. And
Uh, so I did want to talk about the audience for this book and basically who the intended reader of this book is and whether or not that intended reader stayed the same from the inception of the book to completion. I think there are like in remarkable ways there are specific chapters of this book that I feel like I could print out and like hand to my mother and my father who are both educated people but not necessarily interested in this subject outside of their son's own love of literature. And they could come away with kind of a new understanding of the importance and the complexity of translation, and perhaps even find this entertaining. So I also just want to remark, I think this is a book that sits really well beside. I brought these for show and tell. Speaking of Edith Grossman's Why Translation Matters, as well as Mark Palizzotti's Sympathy for the Traitor, which are both kind of similarly framed, I should say, academic books about translation. That also includes, I think, something for a more, commercial quote unquote reader.
yeah, those were actually two of the three or four books that I was in my mind sort of positioning myself against. I felt like those two books, as well as one by David Bellows called "Is That a Fish in Your Ear,"
Hmm.
um, riffing on the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy like translator device. Um, I felt like those were really great kind of introductory books if for this audience you're talking about in a way, people who maybe hadn't thought about translation before or liked it but hadn't really dug into it. And these books were going to say, actually, it's very creative and interesting, and it's not just a mechanical process, and it
Hmm.
raises all these fascinating issues. Um, but I felt like those three books had done that, and I didn't need to do that again. I felt like I could sort of take for granted that, yes, it's a interesting thing, and I don't have to start at square one and sort of justify the existence of a book about translation. I can just proceed. So the other book that I had in mind is a book from well before all those called After Babel by George Steiner
Hmm.
from the
Steiner. Hmm.
70s. And that is a very magisterial Olympian. Here's the nature of the world, and I'm going to pronounce from on high, the meaning of
Yeah.
everything, and the meaning of everything is translation. So I certainly didn't aspire to the tone of that book or the certain exclusionary aspects of that book. Um, but I thought that it was a good time for a book on the philosophy of translation, not just introduction to issues in translation. And, you know, it's funny, I had come off of doing this biography of Herman Rorschach, creator of the Rorschach test for a commercial publisher. And so in my initial proposal to Yale, I had a title that was like glib monosyllabic title, colon, really long listy subtitle. And in my chapter outline, I sort of buried all the philosophy in the back because that's what you have to do in commercial books.
Yeah.
And the editor of Yale said, why don't you call it the philosophy of translation and put the philosophy up front? And I was like, oh, right. Yale University Press, you can do that. Um, so the idea of calling it the philosophy of translation was actually his idea. And I went through a bunch of sort of soul searching, like, do I dare call a book that, you know, in the 2020s? I'm just me. Like, how can I
Uh-huh.
call a book the philosophy of translation? But I ended up deciding that, you know, every book that's ever been called the philosophy of anything is from the outside just a philosophy that you're going to
Yeah.
agree or disagree with. But from the inside, you mean it. And so it's not in a spirit of telling anyone what they should do. It's in a spirit of trying not to hedge and not to waffle and just to say what I think and let
Hmm.
people agree or disagree with it. So I sort of came around to, yes, I'm going to take courage and call it the philosophy of translation. And then everyone at Yale, including the guy who had originally suggested the title, were like, are you sure you want to call it that? Like, why not a philosophy of
Uh-huh.
translation or philosophies of translation? So I sort of made this same argument to everyone, including the person who had given me the title in the first place. And
Uh-huh.
they sort of reluctantly were like, okay, I'm worried. But but I think it did kind of do what I hoped it would do, which is that people know it's coming from somebody who practices it.
Yeah.
So I don't think that they see this title and the author being
Hmm.
me and think, oh, this is going to be someone like mandating what I have to think. You
Yeah.
know, I think they are going to see it as like, oh, okay, so this is someone giving a deeper sense of what lies behind his practice. And so I
Yeah.
think since it's coming from me, I mean, maybe that's why. I don't know
Yeah.
why. But like, um, I haven't gotten the sort of pushback like, how dare you call a book the philosophy of translation? Who do you think you
Yeah.
are?
I was gonna ask that as well because I know that this book has also been under development for many years. You've used some of the, in fact, some of the chapters in this book have been used in for public lectures or for talks that you've given. And I've wondered if there have been if people have contested, what you posit as what is translation and what is the purpose of translation.
Actually, no.
Interesting. Yeah.
And in fact, the opposite happened. So a few years ago, after I gave as a talk what would turn out to be the sort of philosophy core, chapter 3 of the book, someone wrote a review, published a review of Searls's philosophy of translation, saying, well, he's never put it together into a book, but he's given various talks here and there, so you can kind of piece it
Yeah.
together, and then proceeded to outline and review what I hadn't like written up yet,
Yeah.
except in this piecemeal form, and got it totally right. So, like, everything he said like was in fact how I think the pieces go together and what I believe and stuff. So that was encouraging that like the different parts of my mind actually do fit together or whatever the lesson is from that. But it was a
Yeah.
pretty strange experience to like read a review of the book I hadn't written yet.
Yeah. That's very
It's
interesting.
it's out there. Joshua Sperling, if you look it up, it's
Hmm.
called Reading Like a Translator.
Hmm.
And like now that the book exists, like it is equally a accurate review of what I say, even though I hadn't said it yet.
I also wanted to ask about talking, as a bookseller, I'm also interested in the market impediments to publishing translation. And it seems that, yeah, when I've asked publishers and editors, why we see so few books in translation, the reasons cited are often, things like adding, the cost of a translator unbalances a P&L for an editor. That is a profit and loss statement, which who even of these well-intentioned editors who are seeking to bring a book into English, the terms of rights are often complicated. And often, and then of course there is the kind of self-fulfilling bugbear that, translation doesn't sell, and so therefore is riskier for some reason. But I think like many in publishing or many things in publishing, I think a lot of that is unearned conventional wisdom that's passed down through, from editor to editor or generation to generation. But I'm just curious from a translator's perspective, someone who is actively pitching or receiving, asks from publishers, and developing contracts with publishers, as diverse as, Norton or Penguin Classics or, Dorothy, which is a very small press. Like what are you hearing from publishers, and what are those challenges to
Yeah.
publishing translation?
Well, of course, I have a lot of like my own battle scars from years of doing this and my own sense. I mean, basically, I think what you summarized is true. A translator will get
Hmm.
paid more than a foreign author of a literary book because the and maybe that's a problem with how we pay authors, but
Hmm.
if you're acquiring some foreign book as an American publisher, in reality, you might pay $1,000, $2,000, maybe $5,000, and that is not enough to pay a translator for the time it takes to translate a book, especially if it's a
Yeah.
longer book. And so it is quite common for when we're not talking about celebrity J.K. Rowling
Hmm.
and, um, I don't know, Michelle Welbeck's. Uh,
Hmm.
it is quite common for the translator to get paid more, which means that the translator blows the budget of
Yeah.
the other first novel that they might acquire from an American for $2,000.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean that's all perfectly true. Um, you know, from my side, I am more witness to the various ways the systems are set up to favor the publishers and not favor the translators. But I don't know if I want to like get into a big gripe session about that.
Yeah.
But I mean, just in terms of the rights, it's the publisher who buys the rights from the original rights holder, whether that's the author or their agent or the
Hmm.
foreign language publisher, and then it's up to them. So, in other words, even if I go to a publisher with an author I know about, I've translated before, I'm associated with, the author likes me, that
Hmm.
publisher can then get the book on my recommendation and then tell me, okay, here's how much we'll pay you. No
Yeah.
royalties, low rate. And if I say that's not okay, then they're perfectly within their rights to be like, all right, we'll get someone else.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
and um, and there's nothing I can do because I don't have any of the rights. And then
Yeah.
this repeats again if someone acquires world English rights, for example, an American publisher that's then going to license the book to a Indian or Australian or British
Hmm.
publisher, they already have the world rights.
Yeah.
So the publisher they're licensing it to doesn't have to give me the same terms that the American publisher, got browbeaten into giving me. And the American publisher is not going to negotiate on my behalf because they have no
Hmm.
interest in doing that. So then my translation just gets sold or given away to someone else, and I never have a stage of that process where I can veto it or step
Yeah.
in or protect myself. So there are lots of kind
Yeah.
of surprising, complicated little nuances like that. I mean, I think that the money issue probably is the main one. You know, I think people are surprised to hear that a foreign author might get a couple $1,000s from an
Hmm.
American
Yeah.
publisher. But if you start from there, then the fact that you have to pay a translator, more than that to translate the book, and that blows the budget, like that kind of makes sense from the publisher's point of view.
Yeah.
So, the main problem is that there isn't money in it, like there
Yeah.
is in movies and, music.
Right, unless you're selling other kinds of, rights, movie rights, to a book. And just to bring it back to also I guess the philosophy and I should say the political part of translation. So much of it is inherently political. And I think you write about this really well, is that your average American reader, I think, really underestimates the influence of American or British tastes on all of literature and foreign rights.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that is truer now than it's been before. I have heard from, for example, the foreign rights person of a
Yeah.
German publisher, um, who says that a German book that they're trying to sell translation rights to, maybe they can sell to 5 or 6 countries
Hmm.
until there's the English translation and the big article in the Guardian or the New Yorker, and then they can sell to 20 or 30 countries. And
Wow.
then the people that they sent a copy to a year and a half ago who told her, "Oh yeah, we're looking at it, looks great," will see the article in the Guardian 2 years later and write to her and be like, "Oh, this book sounds really interesting. Will you send me a copy?" And this German like rights director will have to swallow their pride and just be like, "Sure, we'd love to send you a
Yeah.
copy of the book that you swore to me you were reading 18 months ago." Like, um, but the fact is true that English is the gatekeeper language for the careers of literary writers around the world. I mean, like, think about that from the writer's perspective. You can sell your book to 5 or 6 countries unless it goes into English, and then you can sell
Yeah.
to 20 or 30. So, of course, you're going to be paying more attention to that market, which is too bad because it just means that, like any hegemony, you're going to end up influencing um, the way people write. And also, it's too bad that that Dutch novel that would really speak to Chinese readers isn't going to get to Chinese unless it also speaks to American readers first.
Hmm. And yeah, you talk about when you were in middle school in New York, you were given four options for a language requirement. You had Latin, German, French, Spanish, and then you say, now my son is going to school, and those languages are Russian, and there was one other, I think.
No, there's Chinese and
Oh,
Spanish.
Chinese and Spanish. That's what it
Yeah,
was.
so
And right, it's
Spanish
like,
seen as a American, North and South American
right,
language, not as an old world European language, and
right,
Chinese seeing as a up and coming language. So,
right.
Western Europe's stock has fallen.
Yeah, and right, these
But
things are.
there are plenty of languages that are not on either of those lists,
Yeah, right. Yeah, but it's a matter of funding, educate, how we supply, how we fund education. These curriculums really matter. You talk elsewhere in the book about like, what, you decided to approach, the languages that you did and learn of the languages that you did through, a series of life choices. And, because of that, these other paths, you didn't study Korean, you didn't study an indigenous language to America, for example, and therefore like these choices really matter in what we end up reading.
Yeah, John Keane has a great comment about that every door that opens up to you,
Hmm.
you're also not opening all the other doors that could have been
Yeah,
opening up to you. So like that's just how it is.
yeah.
And um, you know, it's funny. In a way, I think we might be giving people a slightly misleading idea of the book because a lot of this stuff, my take on it is that it's kind of the same as with any other writer.
Hmm.
Um, like, sure, there are issues of representation in translation, what gets translated from which languages, from which genders, from which
Hmm.
kinds of genre fiction or whatever. Um, but I kind of feel like except insofar as every individual case is different, it's basically the same as issues of representation in, say, publishing or
Yeah.
getting or writing and getting a novel published if you're a writer living in America of this or that gender, background, set of interests, not to mention, of course, language. So, you know, in a way, the like key piece of my philosophy of translation is that what is translation? If it's nothing else, it's that you're reading one thing and you're writing something else
Hmm.
connected to it. You're reading a book in Norwegian and you're writing a book in English in a way that goes together. So I don't think anyone with any idea of translation could really disagree with that. And so
Yeah.
I sort of start off by saying, okay, so where's the center of gravity there? And I think that the writing part is just like any other writing, more or less. Like, sure, you're writing under a strong constraint. I have to not just write anything, I have to write septology that I've already read in
Hmm.
Norwegian, you
Yeah.
know. So that's a constraint, but you're always writing under constraints. There are always genre constraints. There's
Hmm.
always, market constraints. And there's always, I mean, all of the words you're using were defined by other people and like are in you're not free to just choose it. The language
Right.
is there already. Like that's a big
Hmm.
constraint, you know. So I don't think that the writing part is really what's telling.
Yeah.
I think you just have to be a good writer, and in the same way that you have to be a good writer when you're writing anything. And and so most of the political questions I feel like kind of fall under that umbrella. Like, sure,
Hmm.
it can be a political issue to write about certain things in a certain way, and it's a political issue to translate certain things in a certain way in the same zone. Like I don't know that translation has many special issues that aren't existing already just in the world of
Yeah.
being a public person who's out and making statements and writing and using whatever prestige they have, etc. So it's really the reading part that I spend most of the time talking about in the book. And, um, you know, I love reading. I really think reading is incredible. And that is the center of the book, frankly. Proust has this line he translated, and in his
Hmm.
translator's preface to the book he had translated into French, he called reading that fruitful miracle of communication in solitude, that you're by
Hmm.
yourself and yet someone else is there communicating with you, even though you're not out in the social world interacting with people. You still get to be by yourself, and yet you are communicating.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that is a miracle. It is a miracle that when I'm reading Pride and Prejudice, I'm not deciding what Mr. Darcy looks like. I'm reading what Mr. Darcy looks like, and the book
Right.
is telling me.
Yeah.
And even though the book is telling you perhaps something different, and you have a picture in your mind of Mr. Darcy that doesn't match my picture, you're not making it up either. You're reading it too. You know, Nobody talks about is it a faithful reading
Yeah.
experience the same way
Mhm.
we talk about is it a faithful translation, because everyone knows that reading isn't like photocopying it into your brain. Reading is engaging with it in this kind of two-way complicated living process, right? And so um you know if you take that seriously, that kind of can get unpacked into all sorts of stuff about translation. Like
Yeah.
the fact that, you know, sure, there's no faithful reading, but in another way, like there's no real question about faithful translation because everyone's faithful to what they think they're finding there, but
Yeah.
sometimes they're just bad readers,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. And there are plenty
So,
of bad readers who give unfaithful opinions about books based on things that they've either misunderstood. It happens much more often in reading, people who are reading in the language that they speak as opposed to reading in translation as well.
So I just think that I mean, it's almost a tautology, because if you're
Hmm.
calling what you're writing a translation, then even if it's some extremely, you know, Robert Lowell glancing reimagination, like the Odyssey set in outer space with, five gendered aliens or whatever, like, if you're still calling that a version of the Odyssey, then there's some
Hmm.
aspect of the vibe that you are trying to bring into your new version. And that's why you're calling it a translation instead of just calling it a new book, right? So, you're faithful to that, no matter how, unfaithful or loose in the normal sense of the word your translation ends up being. You're still like trying to read what's the original.
We're gonna start with audience Q&A in just a little bit here. So please start submitting those questions to the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen or the chat window. We will pull questions from both.
I
And
feel
then
like I should give one example.
yeah, I was gonna ask that next if you want to give an example of
Okay.
yeah.
So I think one good example would be I was translating Jan Fosse from Norwegian, his septology. And
Hmm.
one of the characters in the book picks up a newspaper at like a cafe table. And it's from a small town, not the big city where the character is at the moment. And um, and the name of this newspaper is Gula Tiden, which is the Gulen Times. But that didn't mean anything to me. So I
Yeah.
go online, I look it up. There's no information about a newspaper called that. I look up Gula, and sure enough, it's this place in Norway, but whatever. I don't know what it means. And so, he's a living author. I asked him, I emailed him. I'm like, what is
Yeah.
this? So it turns out Gula Tiden is a actual newspaper that's on a certain side of a linguistic debate that's very important to Fosse that he wrote for in his 20s. None of which he told me when I asked him. I found that out years later some other way. When I said, what is this newspaper about? He didn't tell me any of that
That context, yeah.
because he didn't feel that that's what I needed to be thinking about in translating it.
Hmm.
He didn't feel like it was important. He told me, oh, gula is this word, archaic word for a strong wind. And actually, there was a famous like council 1,000 years ago that is thought of as the like first national law of Norway that was given at like the Gula Council or whatever. And then he said, but you can just translate it country times or whatever you want, is what he said to me in the email. And I mean, I knew that, but it was nice to get the reinforcement that like
Yeah.
I didn't have to literally translate it. And so I was like, okay, well, nothing outweighs the requirement to have the feel or the associations be right. So I'm like, all right, I want a normal newspaper name. I don't want anything that's going to trip readers up. I mean, like if I had put the Gula Times, then everyone would be like, what? But like the book has this very placid surface. It really like keeps the reader flowing through. You don't want to put a boulder in that stream and, block it. So it has to be a normal newspaper name. I'm thinking like medieval. I'm thinking strong wind, like
Hmm.
outlying northern Vikings. So I ended up saying that the guy picks up a copy of the Northern Herald from the table. Northern Herald. And Foster's like, that's a great translation. And I was like, you know what, Jan, you're right. That is a
Okay.
great translation. Because, it does everything
Yeah.
that you need that to do at this part of I mean, it's not like a crucial part of the book. It's a passing thing.
Yeah.
But the Northern Herald sort of subliminally gives you what the Gula Times was doing in Norwegian. And so that in a way is what I mean by a translation being a reading. You know,
Hmm.
when I first came across Gula Tidend, I didn't know how to read it. I didn't know what it was doing in this book. Luckily, I could ask him. If he was a dead author, I would do research among scholars who had, you know, written encyclopedias of septology the way they're Joyce encyclopedias or whatever.
Yeah.
Or I would just think harder about it.
Yeah.
And it was, in a way, the reading process that mattered in that whole situation of like, I have to try and get to some way that this makes sense to me in the book. Now, Northern Herald is not a translation that any other translator would come up with
We'll make in another, right.
because it has a certain, you know, it has a certain, you might say, subjectivity or
Mhm.
arbitrariness to it. But it's not the subjectivity of me forcing myself on the text and just doing whatever I want with it and having my way
Mhm.
with it. It's the subjectivity of my encounter with it as a reader and like getting to a point where this is how I see what the text is doing and then translating that. So what that's why there are no best translations of the Iliad or Anna Karenina or whatever you want to name, because everyone is actually translating their reading of the text. And there's a lot going on in their individual reading of the text. So, anyway, that I think is one example. The book has a lot of examples, which
Mhm.
I think is fun. And I think
Yeah.
philosophy works best when it has a lot of examples and isn't just on this abstract plane the whole time.
Yeah, I think
And
it makes really clear just the number of decisions made in any given sentence, let alone any given word,
and
when
people
you're working.
understand
Mhm.
translation examples. Like even when I was teaching in a
Yeah.
university, like it's hard to teach close reading. It's hard to teach that you can have an interpretation of The Great Gatsby that's better or worse, even if it's not right or wrong. But show people 5 translations of a Rilke poem, and they're going to think that some of them are better and some are worse, even
Right.
though none are right or wrong.
Mhm.
And they get it. It's just obvious on the surface. So it's a really good way into understanding how reading works.
We're gonna transition now to some questions from the audience.
Let
We
me
have
say
a
one
Yeah.
thing, which is
Yeah,
I
go for it.
noticed it flitting. I tried not to look, but the someone was asking about where that Proust line was from.
Oh, yeah.
Um, I have a book which translates both Proust's essay called On Reading and a bunch of his notes and other prefatory stuff to his translations of John Ruskin, which is where that's from. So it's out of print, unfortunately. If any American publishers are listening and want to get it back into print, hit me up. But it's a Hesperus Press book called On Reading by Proust and John Ruskin. That is the best place to find it. Um, there are other editions and translations of On Reading that have different elements of the supplemental material that Proust wrote about Ruskin. But anyway, that's my answer to that check question.
Looks like James Crosley had it half correct, or maybe fully correct, but he said Ruskin's Bible of Amiens.
Right, that's one of
But
the 2
yeah,
books that Proust translated into French, and it was in the preface of that that he made that comment. But
excellent.
most easily available in the one I did.
The Hesperus edition.
Yeah.
Excellent. Let's see. First question from the audience here is from Amy Chor, who says, one of my questions is, what advice would you give to newish translators?
Um, Good question, and I get asked a lot. There are
Hmm.
organizations out there, and so, both specifically translation organizations like ALTA, American
Hmm.
Literary Translators Association, but I think in a way more importantly, um, places that publish beginning translators as well as experienced translators and literature and translation, Asymptote, Words Without
Hmm.
Borders, places like that. Um, a lot of translators get their start by taking some passion project and getting it published there, and that's how they get noticed. And then they can use that when they apply for a grant. Uh, there are several others. Other than that, it's very different in different language pairs. I really
Mm,
don't know what there is for Spanish to English translation, much less Vietnamese to English
yeah.
translation. I have more experience with German to English because have been doing it longer, and I've sort of run across the other language things pairs that I know. But so that's one very practical answer. Penn has sample contracts for translators. There's all sorts of practical beginner advice that you can find through those kinds of organizations that I mentioned. And also, you can get put in touch with other more experienced
Yeah.
translators in your language pair who can tell you. In terms of the like maybe more deep aspect of that question, you know, I think you just have to read. I think, if you read 10,000 books, you're going to be a good translator. Like that's kind of what I think. Which isn't necessarily helpful advice, but that's kind of what I think. Um, and that's true for being a writer too. I mean, of
Hmm.
course, that's my vision of being a writer, not like working internally on my inner voice, which I'm going to express, but like reading and seeing what's out there and positioning yourself in the world of other people who are reading and writing other books.
Yeah.
Don't know if that's helpful, but you know,
Yeah. And I'll say too that like publications like Asymptote and Words Without Borders, which Words Without Borders does much more than they're much more than just a publishing arm. They also support translators in other ways. And I saw someone mention, I think Patsy said Guernica as well. These are also like I read these publications. Editors read these publications as well, even if they're not acquiring based on what is published in Words Without Borders to have a byline, even just one byline somewhere. That's important for when, first thing an editor is going to do when you propose something, I imagine, is they look you up. They see where your name appears. So
right.
those are good places.
So, as with any creative thing, like you're going to be working for free or for little money at the beginning because you're trying to convince someone to pick you to do this project, but then you'll eventually build up a name and a reputation. There's
Hmm.
a great essay by a Korean to English as well as English to Korean translator named Anton Her
Hmm.
called something like Surviving the Emerging Translator's Valley of Death, um, where he gets very nitty gritty about like, what do? You don't have a book deal yet, and you can't get a book deal unless you have a book deal. So what do you do? Like that would probably be worth looking up.
Yeah.
Her Hur.
Yeah. Anton Her. I'll write that in the chat here. Oh, looks
Oh,
like Julia. Oh, hello, Julia Sanchez.
hi
Julia.
Julia, thanks.
Yeah, posted right there. Perfect. Thanks. Let's see. We have an anonymous attendee asks, can you speak to the idea of the translator as curator? Is this something you're able to, do you ascribe to this? If so, what kind of, I think metaphorically, paintings or sculptures would be exhibited in a gallery of your curation? I love that. And then
Yeah.
also, what is your favorite, for other translators, what is your favorite gallery to visit?
Huh. Well, many great questions in there. Um, where to begin? Well, again, this is going to be different for different contexts, meaning language pairs, among other
Hmm.
things. So, working with languages like French and German, where there's been a lot of French and German literature translated into English before, relatively many editors and other bookish people in America read French and German compared to, say, Swahili.
Hmm.
And so your whole set of responsibilities is kind of different um, in terms of um, choosing and picking your battles, how hard the battles are. One of the first, well, several of the first translations I did were of sort of minor things by canonical authors.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to convince someone to publish a Rilke book by an unknown translator than it is to convince a publisher to publish a novel by an unknown
Right.
novelist.
Hmm.
So, kind of latching on to already famous people is
Hmm.
one of the advantages of being a translator if you're translating from a language that has any famous writers. You
Yeah.
know, I don't know how many Lithuanian poets anyone in this Zoom could name. So if that happens to be the language you're translating from, you might not have that option. And also, your curatorial responsibilities are going to be different.
Yeah.
Just like if you're a curator of, oceanic art versus French Impressionism at a
Hmm.
museum, like those curators have very different lives, right? Um, I do, uh, I do like the aspect of translation that it's very varied. I'm doing one book for a couple months, and then I'm living in some very different world later. There was a point a couple years ago where I was doing like Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse and Bambi, which is another actually Austrian
Hmm.
novel from the 20s. And I was just like, I might be hitting my limit here of like dead German men of the 30s. And I made an intentional effort to try and like take on projects by like female, living, young,
Hmm.
other people and not just be kind of burnishing the marble statue of Thomas Mann again, kind of thing. That said, I don't think all I was doing was burnishing the Thomas Mann marble statue. I think I did feel that there was a side of him that hadn't been um, captured in English, and in fact, people had a kind of uh, wrong idea of
Hmm.
of his writing, and so I was trying to like. I mean, I decided to call the book "New Selected Stories" because I was trying to say, no, this is not your grandfather's Thomas Mann. There's like an actually funny, warm, humane side of him that you haven't seen in English before, where the famous books are Dr. Faustus and
Yeah.
Baked in Venice. Um, but anyway, that said, it still is Thomas Mann, and I don't have as much responsibility to him. Like, I'm not doing as
Hmm.
much sort of political good retranslating dead Thomas Mann as I am translating a first novel by a 34-year-old woman.
Yeah.
Right. So that is in a way how that's the conscious way that I think about curation. I'm like, I'm how am I going to spend my time and like what am I what am I trying to do? I used to wonder, I mean I still wonder, I don't know that I'm ever going to find out if the different books I translate by different people sound the same. I kind of used to think
Interesting.
they did. Like, does my Rilke kind of sound like my Gide and kind of sound like
Oh,
my Fossa?
yeah.
And I used to think kind of yes early in my career. And then I started having publishers come to me and I was translating like biographies of some random person by some other
Yeah.
random person. And so like my curatorial aspect was reduced because I wasn't
Right. Because
picking,
now you're
because
taking
that would
work.
be an
Yeah.
argument for like, oh, my Gide sounds like my Rilke because I'm picking both of
Right.
those texts. So I'm picking the most Rilkean Gide and the most Gidean Rilke. But then if someone just hires me to do something, like I'm not doing any of that. So if I have a voice even there, like that would be interesting to.
But someone else, I feel like, would have to determine that or
Right,
like
and,
go through.
you know,
Yeah.
maybe you have
Yeah.
29
Apparently I have 29
cases,
of
so,
them.
like, you're
I'll
probably
do a
better
case
positioned
study.
than anyone,
Yeah.
Spencer.
Julia,
But
Julie
that's
in the
that's
chat
just another
says,
aspect of curation, right? Like, insofar as I bring whatever I'm
yeah.
translating into the universe of my voice, then that's a kind of abstract
Hmm.
way of curating, yeah.
Yeah, Julia in the chat, Julie Sanchez, another wonderful translator in the chat says, "I think we all have a scent rather than a sound," which I think is a funny metaphor for it. There was let's see if I can find it. Oh, here. Let's see, we'll take one more question here, and then we can give, any closing remarks. But I thought this question was interesting in the chat from Rory Bernstein, who says, how close to native fluency does a person have to have in order to be a translator? And I think this is interesting just in the context of, I believe of the four languages that you translate from, Norwegian is the newest. Is that correct? Um,
Yeah, Fossa outed me, in fact. So the first
was it
time,
Fosse who did? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So we did a Zoom event for the book that came out when the pandemic started. So it was the first time
Yes,
we were doing a co-event.
I remember this. Yeah.
And he said, I just don't understand how Damion produces such beautiful translations. He doesn't even know Norwegian. So he was the one who outed me. So the answer to the question is, as always, it depends. There are, of course, two main ends of the spectrum of opinion on this about like being super fluent, perfect, scholarly, knowing everything about the original language, or on the other end, pretty much where I am, which is you have to be able to read and you have
Hmm.
to be able to feel as though you're reading appropriately. But you don't have to be able to write. I don't write even in German, which I know best. I wouldn't write a book in German. I wouldn't write a business letter in German, but
Yeah.
that's not my skill. I read in German really well. Um,
Hmm.
to Norwegian, where, you know, I mean, at least at the beginning of when I was translating Fossa, I learned it by reading. I didn't speak it at all, spoken. And yet, I used sort of the first book I did was a co-translation, and I had read some of his books translated into German, and I acquired an ability to read Fossa and read Norwegian. Um, does that mean that I would feel comfortable translating a subtle, socially nuanced novel from Norwegian? Maybe not. I might not feel that I'm able to read it well enough to grasp it and to translate it. Um, so I, there's a part of the book that goes into this debate because David Bellows, who I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
um, has said, I think this is rubbish. People who say you don't have to know the language to translate it. And I address that. There's some situations in which what he's saying makes sense, but also there are all sorts of different kinds of expertise. There are all sorts of different ways you come to your expertise. And the gatekeeping of saying you have to pass a language exam in order to be allowed to translate this book, is not always appropriate. And it's not always appropriate for the kind of book you're translating, for the kind of publication you're translating it for. It does depend. But what that means is like, no, you're not barred from translating if you're not fluent in the language you're coming from. I used to say you have to be a native speaker of the language you are translating into,
Hmm.
and um, and Anton Her, correct, taught me that that's not true because there are different stories about where writers come from. I was, without realizing it, thinking in terms of English speaker from the center who's learning other languages.
Hmm.
Whereas there are all sorts of people who maybe their first language was an Indian language and that, like from India, not from Native America,
Yeah.
uh, and they emigrated when they were 5 years old, and now English is the language they
Right.
write in. And it's just simply not true to say, oh, if you're not a native speaker of English, your English isn't good enough. That just does not acknowledge the many complicated life experiences that people have in the world.
Yeah.
So I no longer say you have to be a native speaker of English to
Hmm.
translate into English, but what I say is you have to write well in English because you're writing a book in English. Like
Yeah.
that's what you're doing. Um, People think of if I'm translating a French book into English, what I'm doing is taking a language exam in French.
Hmm.
And I'm asking to be graded on my French competence by someone who is able to teach French 1.
Hmm.
And that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is writing a book in English. And so, like, a reviewer shouldn't come along and say, I can't review this book translated from French because
Right.
I don't know
Because I
French.
don't know. Right.
But it's like you can enjoy a Cinderella story when you're 3 years
Yeah.
old. You can
Yeah.
enjoy a Poseidon story when you don't know Greek. Like
Yep.
you're reading a book in English. So only if you think your job is to, grade the language competence would it make sense to say, oh, I can't review that book because I don't
Mhm.
know French. But you read books in English by people from other life experiences than yours all the time. Like that's your job. You review books by people different from you every day. So why not review this one?
Yeah. I think that is an excellent note to end on. Thank you, Damien, for joining us tonight. Thank you all of you out there for watching.
And
Um,
apologies for the technical
oh,
glitch.
we'll edit that out. That's we'll make it movie
Oh,
magic as they
will
call
you
it.
edit it out of our minds too?
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Damien, did you have any final comment you wanted to give before we head out for the
No, I
evening?
mean, especially since we lost that time. If there are other questions that you think are worth getting to, that's fine. But if not, then just thank you to everybody.
Yeah. Thank you everyone so much. Really appreciate you attending live. Again, we'll send a, slightly edited recording of this conversation to you in the next few days. To everyone, take care. The book is The Philosophy of Translation by Damion Searls. Please have a wonderful evening and rest of your week, and please be well.